What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia!
And Victoria.
That was really high-pitched of me.
I know. I'm very excited. We're back.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore a variety of new perspectives and use books as tools for personal and community growth.
This week, we are talking about The Sea of Monsters by Rick Riordan. This is the second book in the children's series Percy Jackson and the Olympians, in which Percy and his crew of demigods tried to save their camp by following the path of Odysseus into the Sea of Monsters to retrieve the Golden Fleece.
In this episode, we will be talking about the full book, and there will be spoilers. So if you care and you haven't read it yet, go read the book and come back. If you don't care about spoilers, or if you've already read it, let's go. I think it's really funny. We're like, welcome back, new season. Here's the sophomore book of a series that we talked about like a year ago. But here we are. It was also because Julia just got done with finals, or is actually wrapping them up right now. But
yeah,
is at a place where she can record again, but not at a place where she could read new books.
No.
So we're revisiting a book from your childhood and from my recent quarantine lockdown times. Because this was one of my like pandemic series. Though, as we'll get to, I didn't realize it's actually been quite recent that I read this. I'm like, yeah, I read this like a year ago. No, Victoria, you read it like 4 months ago. It just feels very long.
Yeah, it's a weird way to start a season, for sure. But it was a book we had both read. And it's a fun one. I'm excited. We're starting off easy breezy in January.
Julia, what was your experience reading it?
I'm pretty sure, because it's the shortest book in the series, I'm pretty sure I read it in like a day as a teenager, racing to get through the series. Because part of the reason why I am a late adopter of things, and part of the reason why is because I want there to be a lot that I can consume all at once. Or not all at once, but like it'll last me longer. And then I reread it because you brought all the books to our apartment from Varun's place during the pandemic, and so I was like, yeah, I'll reread these. And I reread it much more slowly. It was like a couple chapters a night. So I got to digest it a bit more. We'll start off by saying, this is objectively not the best book in the series. It's like, you know, it's a sophomore book. The series started with this super explosive title, and there was this big mystery, and it's a coming of age, and he's finding out who his father is, and like, you're creating a world, like there's all this stuff, you know. And then the second book, it's a second book in a 5-part series, right? So you have to expand the world a bit, but not too much, because you have to be able to continue growing it and continue raising the stakes all the way up until book 5. So like, it's fun, you know. It's not, well, I mean, we think someone dies in the middle, so it's maybe not as lighthearted as it feels, but yeah, I think it's even more lighthearted in certain ways than the first one. Like, I think he sort of lets off the gas a little bit for this one. But then the cliffhanger at the end, because it's literally the last 3 lines, and you think it's this like super lighthearted book that's just kind of like, you know, a stepping stone to get to something bigger, and then he drops you with this cliffhanger at the end, and you're like, whoa! And so that's the feeling you're left with. And then of course you have to immediately read the next one. At least when I was a teenager I did. I was like, holy shit, what? And then you just gotta keep going, because it picks up right where I left off. Yeah, those are kind of my thoughts. How about you?
So I mentioned in our episode on The Lightning Thief that I started reading this series because I was quarantining in my boyfriend's parents' basement, and they had a bunch of books on their shelf, and I was like, this feels like more fun than these long books I promised Julia I would read. So that's when I started reading the series, and I brought books like 1 through 4 maybe I didn't realize there was a fifth book, or maybe they didn't have it sitting on the shelf. I don't know why I only got 1 through 4, and brought them back to our apartment. And that's when Julia reread them, and I stared at them for a very long time until I had to return the books because Rude and I were moving out of the Chicagoland area, and I was like, oh, I should probably read these while I have the time. So then I kind of started them, and like Julia said, book 2 ends on such a cliffhanger that I just then immediately devoured books 3 and 4 right afterwards. So some of my details were a little fuzzy when we started prepping for this episode, because I'm like, oh, I've read all of them all at once, so right. I need to like portion out what happened in which book. But yeah, I think as a book overall, like this one was less memorable than 1, 3, and 4 in this series. I did appreciate we get some new characters, and we will kind of dive into Tyson in particular in this episode, as well as we get to see new sides and new elements of characters we've already met. So I think in that aspect, it kind of works well as a sophomore book, like because you're expanding the world, but more like expanding Percy's world just a little bit more.
Yeah.
Than in the following books, you kind of explode the world of all the Camp Half-Blood campers a bit more. And yeah, I still haven't read book 5, so that's on me, and I don't really know. Oh, I remember why. I was trying to borrow it from the library, and if anyone from Chicago Public Library is listening, I'm very sad because I needed to go in person to renew my library card, but I wasn't currently in Chicago, so my library card has expired. It's a whole saga, so I can't currently download any ebooks from the library, and so yeah, that was right when book 5 was like available for me to check out, but it wouldn't let me.
Oh no.
So usually this is the part of the episode where I talk about the author, but I did that at length in our last episode that we talked about this series, is number 59. So if you want to go back and listen to that, we discussed the first book at length, as well as some like the high level themes and like why Rick Riordan wrote this series, kind of his inspiration as a teacher and as a father. So you can listen back for all of that in-depth discussion. About this book in particular, it was published in 2006. It eventually had a film adaptation that I believe we don't speak about, is what I've heard. Came out in 2013. As well as this whole series was turned into graphic novels as well. So the graphic novel version of this book came out in 2013 as well. Overall, the series, this was a new fun fact for me, the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series has been on the New York Times Children's Series bestseller list. So it's like grouped by series, not individual book. And it's been there for 605 weeks.
Whoa!
The only series on the list that have been there longer are Harry Potter and Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which both of those series came out before, or started coming out before Percy Jackson did.
That's 12 years.
Yeah, basically since the books were published,
wow.
They've been a riot. Though I will know, I went down a rabbit hole of like now how the New York Times bestseller list works, and there's a lot of interesting information about what's problematic about it, how people have messed the list to like make the books bestsellers, how it's sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a book is advertised that it could become a bestseller, it becomes a bestseller, all those things. So take it with a giant grain of salt, but it's been a very important book series for a lot of American children, and globally it has a reach as well. If you didn't have a chance to listen to the Lightning Thief episode and you're just jumping in with book 2, good for you. Things to know about Rick Riordan is that he's an American author. He was a teacher, he is a father, and those experiences have influenced the books he's written. He started this series in the world of Greek mythology. He's written some other series about other mythologies, and he is also kind of championing an imprint that publishes other authors' YA fiction retellings of mythologies from around the world. His niche is Greek mythology, and his brand has expanded and exploded to encompass and promote authors from a wide variety of backgrounds, which is pretty cool. And this is his first series, so this was the book series that put him on the map in the YA fiction world.
Let me summarize this book, and then we will get into the characters, because how he builds characters is really fascinating, and I feel like I've gotten more critical of it as I've gotten older.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so we'll get into that. Sea of Monsters. Technically, each of the books in this series loosely follows a different Greek hero's journey. So you've got Odysseus in this book from the Odyssey. But to change things up, their goal is to find the Golden Fleece, which is part of Jason and the Argonauts, but the book that's based on Jason is the Battle of the Labyrinth. Anyway, here's the plot. Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson Percy's baby Cyclops half-brother. Join Clarice, who's kind of the human bully from the first book. She's the daughter of Ares, on a quest to get the Golden Fleece. They need it because the tree, it's like a magical tree that guards their camp. It creates this like force field, protective force field. It's been poisoned. And this tree used to be a person. So they're all very emotionally attached to it. And it's dying. So the Golden Fleece is like the only thing that can heal it. And then they also go because Percy's getting these like weird telepathic voicemails from his boy Grover, who we find out has been captured by Polyphemus.
Big Cyclops man.
The Cyclops man. Yeah. So the gang go into the Sea of Monsters where Odysseus got stuck for 10 years. It takes them a couple days. But they meet all the besties. So Scylla the sea monster, Circe the witch, and then of course Polyphemus the Cyclops. And it's genuinely the same one that was blinded by Odysseus. So they have a slight advantage because he's blind. And there's a lot of conflict and differences of opinion on how to run the quest, and they all kind of get split up. Ultimately, Tyson is the one who saves the day from the Cyclops. And then Percy and Clarice sort of form a truce against the real bad guys who are just sort of lurking in the background. It's Luke, the villain from the first book, and his buds who are trying to resurrect Kronos and restore chaos and destroy the gods and all that. Then, at the very, very end, there's the cliffhanger that I was talking about, where they put the fleece on the tree, and the fleece heals the tree so well that they bring the person that the tree used to be back to life. And her name is Talia. She's a daughter of Zeus. And you're just like, holy shit, things get a little dicey. And we go from there. So yeah, that's the book.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis.
Thank you.
I particularly liked how, like, again, in this book, we get these elements of the present day world we live in kind of reframed as if Mount Olympus is now New York and Hades is now in LA. We got those in the first book, and in this book, the new element is that, like, the Bermuda Triangle is where all these sea of monsters are, and I'm like, that's so perfect.
Yeah.
I love it. We also have elements of American history that come up that we'll talk about a little bit, and a lot of this story takes place in Florida and Miami, and it's really fascinating. So yes, it's still very much set in present day United States with all these elements of the Greek mythological world. So for this episode, we wanted to pull out 3 characters and do kind of like an in-depth character study, which if you're from the literary world or if you're not familiar with it at all, a character study is when you just dive deep on one character or a couple characters to explore who they are, what we can learn from them, how they interact with other characters, and maybe any themes or motives or big ideas that the author is able to present to us through these characters. So instead of diving into a lot of the plot elements, like we said, this book is like generally okay. It's good. Not as memorable as some of the others, but we do have some really fascinating characters that we wanted to talk about because we have feelings.
Boy, howdy, do we have some feelings.
So Clarice is the first character we want to talk about, and we met her in book 1, and we get to know her more in book 2. I won't say anything more because we're trying not to spoil the future books if you haven't read those yet. We'll stay just with book 2. So Clarice is kind of this bully figure. She gets to go on this quest. She gets like nominated to go. There's this guy named Tantalus who's brought in to like help run some of the summer activities at the camp. And Clarice is Tantalus's favorite camper. And she wins this race partly because the other competitors are like stunned by appearance of these like attack birds that come, and they're trying to like fend off and save themselves and save each other, but Clarice wins the race. Tantalus is like, she's the best, even though they're like, wait, we were just attacked by these birds and you didn't do anything, you just sat there and watched? Dude, you're supposed to be the supervisor. Anyways, so Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson are kind of shunned, and Clarice is kind of the favorite. And so when Annabeth and Percy ask Tantalus to send someone on a quest to help save the camp, Tantalus chooses Clarice instead of Percy and Annabeth. So there's a little bit of tension there about who gets to go. But ultimately, Percy still goes on the quest, because that's the theme of a lot of these books, is Percy goes anyways. But we won't get too much into that, because we're here to talk about Clarice.
Yep.
She gets chosen to go on the quest, and at first, I think, especially because we're reading the story from Percy's point of view, it's like a negative thing. Like, why does she get to go? Like, yeah, she's like a bully, she's strong, she can fight, but like, Percy is still very much like, it should be me, because that's kind of his MO. It always should be him, or at least his friends, that get to go on these kind of things. But she's still, like, we get to see another side of her, which I think is really fascinating.
This feels kind of like in the sixth Harry Potter book, when you finally get, like, this is Draco's book. You know what I mean? This is, in the film especially, right? This is Draco's film. You know, this feels like Clarice's book, in the sense that, like, you finally get to understand, like, why she is the way she is, in a lot of ways. Yeah, I feel it's a good example of how this common sort of thing you see, I think, in popular culture now, where if you get the backstory of a bully, a lot of times what's revealed is that they come from a long line of bullies who sort of pass on this pain, and you sort of see the systemic problem more than, and you feel compassion for, like, the individual character. So, like, her dad is literally the god of war. He's a shithead. Like, he's awful. We met him in the previous book. He puts a lot of pressure on her to be like him, and she hasn't had a lot of opportunities to prove herself, and it's like, it's her dad, you know? But she's also, like, a person. So I don't know, at least my reaction is I feel bad for her, actually. Which, you know, for a very short children's book, it's all a piece of storytelling.
I think it's also interesting how Riordan uses the rivalry between the gods and goddesses of Olympus to kind of inform how he builds out the characters of their children, and how they have these, like, preconceived notions about who each other are. And it's like, okay, we don't like Ares because he's kind of awful. We met him in book 1 and he was, like, really mean to Percy and, like, fought him or whatever. And so we just assume things about Clarice, or we kind of see this, like, you're kind of clouded by, and Annabeth has this a lot, where she's clouded by preconceived notions of, like, who everyone should be. And she even says in book 1 how, like, her and Percy shouldn't get along because Athena and Poseidon don't get along. And I think it's a very interesting way to talk about, like, family differences and prejudices, and, like, how we assume things about other people because of where they came from. And also how that does influence the individual. Like, Clarice is, like, she finally has the opportunity to prove herself, and she puts so much pressure on herself to do it right and to, like, get the Golden Fleece and it to be her quest. So even when Percy and Annabeth and Tyson end up helping her, it's, like, really hard for her to accept it at first, because, like, no, this is supposed to be about me. But we see these interesting glimpses of her, like, she does care about the other people, and maybe she doesn't say it with her words, but, like, there's a moment where there's a Hydra who's attacking Annabeth, Percy, and Tyson, and Clarice, like, swoops in and, like, saves them. I thought it was a really great device too, because, like, even as an adult reader, I was like, holy crap, how are they getting out of this one?
Yeah.
And then, like, Clarice comes in with her Confederate zombie ship, which you're like, what? And, like, saves them. And you're like, oh, Clarice, you, like, care. Like, you don't necessarily get along with these, like, rivals of yours, but you don't want to see them die. Also, it's a 5-part series. Percy can't die yet.
Obviously, yeah. I feel like as an author writing these books, one of the biggest hurdles is, like, they have to survive all these monsters that killed most of the people in the original stories, but they can't survive in the same way that the original heroes did.
Yeah.
So you have to be very clever. Anyway, yeah, should we talk about the undead Confederate soldiers for a second?
Yeah, I guess I was curious if you knew. I didn't dig into, like, any research on this, like, if that was a reference to another undead ship in Greek mythology, like, the fact that, you know, Clarice is the daughter of Ares, like, so we get soldiers, like, it makes sense. They come from, like, a wartime period. They're currently located in the South because that's where a lot of the story takes place, so it makes sense that they're Confederate soldiers. But I also thought it was an interesting choice.
I don't think there's anything in particular, like, in terms of Greek mythology. Rick Riordan does have an interesting relationship with the Civil War. It's been a problem in other books where he uses it in a way where it's like morally ambiguous and people are like not on board with it. So it doesn't always hold up, some of his uses of history, but he never like endorses anything that you're like, oh, but he uses it. Like everything is kind of fair game for him, but it is interesting. Partly why she uses Confederate soldiers is because, like, only the soldiers of people who lost wars are the ones who she can call on, because they shamed Ares by losing a battle.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Of the people who have lost wars on American soil, I feel like the Confederates are the ones to bring into this story.
Yeah.
Also, I did a quick Google search. CSS Birmingham didn't actually exist. Like, everything that comes up is about Rick Riordan's book. So it's a fictionalized, but based off of some history. The CSS Tennessee was a metal, they called it a casemate ironclad ram. I don't know. It looks like some little metal submarine thing to me in the pictures. It was eventually captured by the Union Navy during the Battle of Mobile Bay and eventually was decommissioned and sold for scrap. So I guess he couldn't resurrect that one unless he came up with a backstory of how Clarice also rebuilt it from scrap.
Yeah. And I also think, like, her using Confederate soldiers is also adds to some of the moral gray area of her being, she's the daughter of Ares, but like she's doing her best,
Yeah.
like
she's working with what she's got.
She's working with what she's got, and she, doesn't necessarily, like, she can't change who her dad is,
Yeah.
Something that I thought this book did well was to set her up as like a foil of the real human villain, Luke.
Yeah.
Who, in the first book, like the big twist, right, was that Luke was super nice. Annabeth had this big fat crush on him. He was like, everyone's big brother. And then he turns out to be evil. Whereas Clarice is kind of the reverse. She's like mean, objectively mean, but ends up ultimately when it's down to the wire, she ends up being a good person and like genuinely caring about them and whether or not they survive and all that stuff. She protects her people, but she's just prickly. Yeah, so I feel like part of what this book does is sort of set up, like, there's a lot of moral gray areas, I think. That's one of the themes here, right? Is like, you can't just see things in black and white anymore. And they all kind of go on a different journey in that respect. And I think for Percy, it's sort of visually seeing, like, what someone seems like on the surface is not necessarily what's in their heart. And, like, evil doesn't just look like one thing. So, like, not to stereotype people, I guess.
If it's been a bit since your high school English class, a foil is a character who is presented as like an opposite or as to contrast another character so that you highlight something about that other character. So Clarice would be a foil to Luke to emphasize like how bad Luke actually is, because someone we thought was evil or really bully, mean, has like goodness inside of her. And we don't really, in this book, we like really don't see that in Luke. We've seen him for his true colors by now. And same for Percy. So Percy has like the opinion that people who are nice on the outside and are like good to the core, whereas, we see a difference with Clarice, who like maybe is that more prickly on the outside, but can still have a heart.
Yeah, foil comes from when they used to put foil behind their candles to help amplify the light.
Oh, I wondered where that came from.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. That's cool. So the next character we wanted to talk about is actually only briefly in this book. One of the quote-unquote monsters in the Sea of Monsters is Circe. If you remember, we talked about Madeline Miller's novel Circe, which is a retelling of that Greek myth, super focused on Circe as a character. It's a whole novel about her. We read that a while back on the podcast, and we had a wonderful discussion about that. So that was actually my first introduction to Circe, and I wasn't as aware of the stereotypes or the general impression people had of Circe from the original text of like the Odyssey or any other retellings. So reading Circe in the Sea of Monsters, I'm like, wait, she's not like that. This is wrong. You don't know her. You don't know her like I do.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it made me even more appreciative of Madeline Miller's retelling of that story.
Yeah. Part of what motivated Madeline Miller to write it was that Circe has been used as kind of this stereotype of the man-hating witch and has been very, very one-dimensional in any use of her character. And so she was like, no, we need to get, like, the backstory of her and understand, like, why it would be understandable she would be like that. Like, oh, a bunch of men are invading an island where a woman lives alone? I wonder why she's defensive. They've been trapped on a ship for 10 years. Anyway, so in this book, he, the way that Riordan casts monsters is he takes that stereotype and he just turns it into whatever the modern version is. So he does not give any grace or complexity to his monsters. So he's just taking from the lore that's already there and modernizing it. That's it. And it's a really, really short chapter. But basically, in these books, Circe is running a spa island where if a woman shows up on her shore, she gives her a makeover. And if a man shows up on her shore, she turns him into a guinea pig and makes them like her pets. So it's like a face-off between her and Annabeth, because Percy gets turned into a guinea pig, obviously.
Yeah. Percy and Annabeth are the only two that show up on this island.
Yes.
Of the characters in the story.
Yeah. And so we get these kind of competing feminisms, I guess, and I hate them both. Now, as an adult reading this, I was like,
what do you mean? Like, a white man in 2006 didn't have a really nuanced understanding of, like, third wave feminism.
Shockingly. Yeah, basically the man-hating caricature of feminism placed against Annabeth, whose whole thing is, like, she basically has a very strong, like, I'm not like other girls vibe. Very strong. Mm-hmm. She has this kind of moral superiority because she doesn't, like, care what she looks like or whatever. And I think what the message is supposed to be is, like, I like myself the way I am, which is great. But what it comes across as is you're an evil person if you like makeup, or if you do care about what you look like, you're a bad person, which is, like, gross.
I think there was, like, an element that, like, maybe could have worked if maybe this chapter had more teeth to it, because it is so brief. It is one chapter of them on this island. The reason that Annabeth is able to resist this, like, magical, like, kind of brainwashing is that Hermes has given them this bottle of multivitamins that kind of, like, breaks spells and poisons and stuff and, like, heals your body. And I mean, like, the kind of read I think could be interesting on this book is that the world that tells us that we're not good enough as we are, and that constant narrative of you need to change yourself to be accepted, is almost like this spell that cast on American society. And to break it, you need some other force to, like, push against that and say, no, like, I like myself the way I am. I agree with you. I think it doesn't actually do that.
No.
Like, that's what I wish it did. I also find it really fascinating that a multivitamin, which is, like, so much in, like, still the, like, I don't know, health and wellness diet space of, like, take this magic pill and it will save you, is what actually saves the characters. I'm like, oh, there's so many layers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does kind of come across as, like, Circe is this evil witch who wants to trick you into thinking you're not okay as you are, and you have to spend all your energy, and then you, like, stay on this island forever because you like being beautiful through spas. And honestly, it sounds like a really nice island. Like, I want to go. I was like, wait, a spa treatment, like, hang out with other cool women. The part where they, like, never want you to leave, I'm like, okay, that's problematic, but otherwise I'm like, it's kind of nice.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the book Circe, like, her island became this, like, haven for women, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds really nice. Like, why is a man-free place inherently a trap or evil,
right,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like he could have given it a bit more nuance where, like, Annabeth really looks up to her, to Circe, and Circe, like, is genuinely trying to help her and is just really jaded and, like, tired. You know, they have a bit more dialogue about it, and Annabeth ultimately is like, saving my friends is more important, and has this whole thing about, like, how do I care about how I look and all that kind of stuff. I think this could be much juicier.
We read a fan fiction, it's like Circe and Annabeth, and it's like an entire novel of their relationship, and it's a dialogue about, you know, womanhood and femininity. And I think also what is complicated, because this is a children's story, is that you can't have the element of what happens in the Odyssey and in Circe, the Madeline Miller novel, is that men try to rape Circe.
Yeah.
And that totally changes the narrative of why Circe is the way she is in a children's book, where you don't have that. And it's just like, I don't like men and I turn them into guinea pigs. Yeah, that's, I think, also difficult here. And so I acknowledge, like, Rick Riordan, one, wasn't going to write an entire Circe and Annabeth story for us. Fine, that's a choice he made. But also he has an audience that he can't necessarily delve into all those really difficult topics with.
Yeah. And, you know, I will be completely honest, this is my opinion after rereading it as an adult. When I read it as a kid, I related to it a lot. Because this book is for the nerds and the ADHD kids and the, you know, the people who have some kind of disability, like, thing that makes them weird. I think he knows his audience, you know what I mean? In a certain way. You know, so, like, at the time, I was just kind of grabbing onto anything that, like, made me feel valuable, even if it was at the expense of other women, because that was what was available to us, really. If you wanted to feel good about not wearing makeup or not dressing a certain way or whatever, the media that you had available was at the expense of other women. And so I remember it feeling like a powerful message at the time. And then I reread it. I was like, oh, I don't like this. But so, you know, it served its purpose in a very limited way, I think, for its audience. This is a recurring problem that I think Rick Riordan has actively worked on fixing. Like, he really heavily stereotyped the daughters of Aphrodite as well, who we got mostly from Annabeth's perspective, and she's very judgy of them. Yeah, so he cast them in a pretty negative light of, like, only caring about appearance. And then in his second series, there's kind of an unlikely Aphrodite kid, and so you get to know that cabin a lot better, and it's there's a lot more depth to it. So, you know, like, they have heart-to-hearts over, like, spa days and stuff. You know what I mean? Like, and they have brains, and, like, it's more interesting.
And they have fabulous skin, and, like, tell us their secrets. Like, I mean, that's not a bad thing.
Someone who can give you face masks and stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. We also see, like, this isn't the only, like, female-female relationship we have, which I appreciate. I think especially as the series progresses, we get more and more female characters and their interactions with each other. And you have this, like, complex relationship between Athena and her daughter Annabeth, which is fascinating, too, to, like, kind of unravel. So I don't want to, like, you know, say Rick Riordan messed up Circe. He always messes up adult women. But I think, you know, there's, like you said, he was sticking with the original text, which doesn't favor Circe, casts her as a monster, and so he brings that to modern day. But he also, as an author, kind of explores some other mother-daughter, friend relationships, and not as much, I don't think, in this one, but definitely in the other books in the series.
Yeah, Annabeth's relationship with her mom is really interesting because she clings to it a lot longer than Percy clings to his relationship with his dad in terms of trying to win her approval and stuff. Yeah. And I think that's partly why she cares so much about these kind of stereotypes, because she's trying to perpetuate her mother's alliances and stuff. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that really gets blown to shreds in book 4. And you see that in this book with Tyson. Amazing transition that I just gave myself. Look at me go. So Tyson is Percy's half-brother on his father's side. Most of Poseidon's children are cyclopses or nymphs. Yeah, so he just kind of shows up at Percy's like school.
Okay, so I want to take a moment and talk about how we get introduced to Tyson, because I think there's a lot of weird stuff happening that I'm like, what? So
Yeah.
Percy infamously is at a different school like every year because something always happens and he blows up something or gets in trouble or whatever and gets expelled. And so he's at a new school yet again, and that's where the novel starts. And there's this kid, Tyson, who is a kind of bigger, bumbling kid who doesn't really fit in. It turns out that he was like homeless, and like Percy's mom like kind of advocated for him and took him in. It turns like he's like the class project almost. It feels really weird that they're like, this is our charity case, Tyson, that we take in. And I'm like, what is this? And I know a lot of the, inconsistencies between the mythological world or the world of the Olympians and the rest of modern day society is usually explained away by there's this like mist, and regular humans just like things, they just accept things as they are and they don't see things fully. So they don't notice he's a cyclops. He looks like a normal kid with 2 eyes instead of 1. And even Percy doesn't see through the mist for a while and realize who Tyson is. But it just feels really weird that there's this like whole backstory of Tyson being like a homeless youth who is taken in as a charity case for a private school. And it's just like never explained. Like, I feel like there's other easier ways to introduce Tyson. I just feel like it wasn't fully explored. You do get some of Tyson's like hurt as a kid who like wasn't taken care of, and he's like so excited to have a brother, which kind of causes tension because Tyson is kind of this outcast character, and so Percy has a hard time accepting him as a half brother at first. And then a lot of the story is like the progress of their relationship and like coming to terms and with each other and loving each other and whatnot, building that brotherly bond. So that's interesting. But other weird things is like, why doesn't Percy recognize that Tyson is from the world of the Olympians? Like, he doesn't seem to have a hard time recognizing other people. There's also just, quote, some kids from Detroit who show up for PE class that are actually giants in disguise, which again, like the mist can explain things away. But why did the mist make it like, yeah, these kids from Detroit showed up instead of like, I don't know, kids from another school or prospective students, or like, why are they from Detroit? What shit does Riordan have against Detroit that the Giants are from there? They play a deadly game of dodgeball, and that's why Percy gets kicked out of the school again. And then Annabeth comes in and is like rude as all get out to Tyson, and because we have Percy's point of view, like don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying, Annabeth kind of comes in with all these like, she's trying to maintain the alliances, like she's very in the world. And knows, like, we don't like Cyclopses, we can't trust them, and kind of projects that on Tyson. So anyways, those are my thoughts on the beginning of, like, I think there are so many easier ways to introduce this new character, and we just got real messy and threw in some random details to get there.
Yeah, I mean, part of why we don't know, like, I think there's a lot of hand-wavy stuff where it's like, oh, well, Percy's confused, Percy doesn't understand why he's there, so, like, we don't. But, like, he could have been, like, a foster kid or something. Like, I don't know. Like, where are Cyclopses born? I have a lot of questions, for sure, about why he was just, like, wandering the streets. He wasn't looking for Percy. Like, he just happened to find Percy, right?
Right, yeah.
Which is another weird thing. So then why was he there?
Yeah, I remember there was a detail, I don't remember if it's in this book or another, so I won't go into it too much, but there's, like, some details about Tyson's, like, past and some of the abuse he suffered.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, even that, I'm like, wait, we're just gonna mention that? And we're just gonna keep rolling?
Just
like,
move on? Yeah.
We just, like, throw in abuse as, like, a little, character detail instead of, like, a big deal to talk about. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I know that's not why you wanted to talk about Tyson. Those were my thoughts on Tyson, because otherwise he's a very fascinating character. He grows into someone we really love. We have a moment where we think he dies. Thankfully he doesn't. But yeah. So what are your thoughts on Tyson generally? And we can set his origin story aside for now.
Something I have learned about myself since reading this book the first time, I can kind of put words to it, is I am a sucker for any kind of fantastical character that's like a kind of fantasy metaphor for disability. Like In the new Suicide Squad that came out in 2021, there's like a shark guy who is not very smart. It's just very earnest. And his character just made me cry and cry.
Oh.
And like, there's this part where he makes these little fishy friends and he's having the time of his life. And he's so happy. He's finally happy because everyone hates him because he's a walking shark. And then the tank bursts and all these fish come out and they start biting him and they didn't actually like him. They just wanted to eat him.
Oh.
And I was like distraught. I was so upset. Yeah, so I get really sucked in by those types of characters, and I feel like that's kind of what Tyson is he's a Cyclops, so he's not very smart, and it's just like a really good person, but there's a tendency to make these types of characters oversimplified, and they can be a little condescending, a bit of a condescending depiction to like pull an audience's heartstrings. So you got to be really careful because they can be a really great way to teach people empathy. You know what I mean? So like you have this idea of Cyclopses as monsters, and you know, the only one you know of is from the Odyssey. And then you meet this character and he's like a bit hard to talk to, a bit hard to connect to, like you don't really understand him, and so you sort of watch Percy like start to accept him as a brother and really get close to him, and Annabeth is like genuinely a bitch to him. She's really awful. You're like, girl, what has this child done to you? And she starts overcoming her prejudices as well and realizes maybe the gods don't know exactly what they're talking about. So it can be a great sort of tool for learning empathy and respect for people who are different than you, which is like one of the biggest themes of this book. But in this book, at least, I don't know, I have mixed feelings because like he kind of gets used, he gets like fridged.
What does fridged mean?
So being fridged is it's using a vulnerable person, usually the love interest, usually a woman, and killing them off for the main character's character development. It comes mostly from superhero movies. Like you see this a lot with like the second Batman movie or whatever, right? Where they use the love interest. I think it comes from like a love interest was put in a fridge, literally. And so they call it getting fridged. Anyway, so we think Tyson dies. And like what that does in the plot in some ways is moves the tension between Percy and Annabeth and Percy's personal growth and Annabeth's personal growth forward. Yeah, I'm still trying to decide whether I think Tyson's character in this book specifically is like good representation. Is there enough complexity? Because like the first time I read this book in particular, he was like my favorite character. There's others in other books that I'm obsessed with, like Nico, the Chaos Gremlin, Rachel Elizabeth Dare, who you probably haven't even met yet. Grover's amazing. Amazing characters. But in this book, I loved Tyson, and I'm still very attached to him. And it was just like pure delight for me, and his character is really what makes this book work, in my opinion. But you don't really get to develop his character and his moral complexity until like the very end when he's facing off with Polyphemus and he realizes that like, he kind of realizes what kind of Cyclops he wants to be, and he kind of understands maybe why people don't like Cyclopses. You get a little taste of it, but he gets a lot more moral complexity in later books. That's way more interesting, and like, I like where his character goes. A common mistake that gets made with disabled characters or disabled adjacent fantastical versions is this tendency to make them perfect and innocent and too good for this world, so they have to die kind of characters.
To like accelerate the moral and character growth of another character.
Yes, exactly. I get really excited when I see like a character like the best friend in Rami. He's like a really shitty person sometimes. Yeah. And it's amazing. You're just like, Yay, equality.
Everyone can be shitty.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like, again, like, we have the children's book world where, like, can characters die? Like, we're book 2 of the series, and this is the second time we've had a character we thought died, or Percy thinks dies. The reader might feel differently, but Percy thinks has died, who ends up coming back to life, or is not actually dead. First it was his mom in book 1, and book 2 was his half-brother. Thankfully, I feel like the trope kind of, like, it doesn't continue. We don't get this, like, all the time. Yeah, I think it is kind of complicated a bit. I think it helps, like, the book is mostly told from, like, a limited third person, so, like, we basically only get Percy's perspective on things, so it kind of, there's a bit of a saving grace there, because you're like, well, this is Percy's interpretation.
Right.
Or, like, a close read of, like, it's very close to Percy's point of view throughout the whole book. So it would make sense that the book is about his character growth. And, I mean, we all do this. Like, we do this to other people in our lives of, like, I never saw that person again, but it taught me this lesson. Like, they exist in the world. They're still there, but you just, the one interaction is what changed your own personal narrative. So I think that saves it a bit for me. And the fact that Tyson comes back, it wasn't like Tyson actually died, and then we just forever were like, wait, what? And we do get that bit at the end. I like how you phrased it as far as Tyson deciding what kind of Cyclops he wants to be, and recognizing the strengths Tyson has as well as the weaknesses. I think that we begin to develop here. Again, it's a short book. There's a lot of other stuff happening, so we don't get a sole focus on that, but we learn things like Tyson is really good with metalworking and, like, is immune to fire and has some kind of superhuman strengths about him, even if his social skills and the prejudice other people carry about him as a Cyclops kind of, like, disadvantage him. So I think in, like, the fantasy world, he's a well-balanced character. He's not, like, overly strong and nothing can touch him, but he does have some, like, unique abilities that the humans don't, or the demigods, half human, half gods, don't have. So that he can kind of be more than just, like, a moment of moral clarity for Percy, but actually, like, saves the day in some cases because of his abilities.
That is true. Yeah, I feel like it's enough. Like, in this book, it toes the line, but I think it's enough. And then because he comes back later on in the series, he has his own disillusionment journey, just like all the other demigods, his own version of it. So I feel like it ends up working well.
I'm curious if we would have recorded this episode after I'd read book 2 and hadn't yet read the rest of the series. Like, if my thoughts on Tyson would be different. So to close out, if you enjoyed this book or you're looking for similar things to read or watch, here's what we recommend. Obviously, read the next book in the series. The Titan's Curse is the next one, book 3. I recently started reading Mythos by Stephen Fry, which is more of like a semi-chronological telling of a bunch of Greek myths and kind of just compiling them all in one place with some of Stephen Fry's humor built in, and a really great, like, crash course almost in, like, all things Greek mythology. And then, as we mentioned in this episode, Circe by Madeline Miller is a wonderful read. Madeline Miller has another book out that's also a Greek myth retelling, which is The Song of Achilles, which I haven't read yet, but I've heard good things. What would you recommend?
Okay, so I tried to think of children's books or YA fiction that I read that was at all similar. So I landed on The Thief Lord by Cornelia Funke and Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This was an extremely British YA novel before it was a Miyazaki classic film.
And last but not least, are currently obsessed. I mean, it's been a bit since we've recorded, so there's, like, what's even happened? What have I been into? But yeah, these are the things that are bringing us joy, that we're excited about, that have nothing to do, usually, with what we just read, but we like to talk about anyways. I've been reading Saga, the comic book series, graphic novel thing. I have the entire compendium of, like, all the chapters that have been released up until now. So it's like 80-something, 90-something chapters all in one. It's huge, but it's been wonderful. This was recommended on Instagram. I think I was posting about I read Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan, and I believe it was Victoria Adel as well as Sophia Syntax, both friends of the pod, who were like, Saga, read Saga. So I'm like, okay, I will. Also by Brian K. Vaughan. illustrated by Fiona Staples, which I think is really awesome because I know very little about the comic book world, but I know it is very male dominated. So to see a female artist, and I think it's a really great read. And I believe they're coming out this month with like they've been on hiatus for a while, but they're restarting with new chapters of the series starting this month. So I'm excited to catch up and then read it in real time as it's released.
Victoria's becoming a comic book nerd.
I know. Vern and I have had a lot of fun reading them together and like passing. Like we both have bookmarks in the like this giant compendium of where we're at in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
I mentioned Paper Girls, also really great. I devoured that over the holidays. That's like the comic book adjacent of Stranger Things before Stranger Things was a thing.
Oh.
I'm curious, how much Stranger Things was informed by this. Like, there's just, like, some very similar things. I'm like, But it's all female characters. Like, the group of 4 friends is all female characters. 2 other things you're wrong about is a podcast that I started listening to recently. They have a lot of a back catalog. So I've been listening specifically through the O.J. Simpson trial episodes. And it was also, like, really wonderful to be reminded that everyone starts somewhere, because I listened to, like, their very first episodes, and it's, like, there's, like, no introduction to who they are and what they're doing, and they just dive right into it. It's, like, not as engaging as some of their later episodes. And I'm like, oh, that's so wonderful to be reminded, like, every podcaster, is growing and changing, and they didn't start as a hit show, but they, like, blew up over time and gained a following. So that's been enjoyable. And then I recently bought Tillamook Rocky Road ice cream, and I have to say, it's delightful, because, like, mini marshmallows?
Mm-hmm.
They have, like, legit full-size mini marshmallows in it. Sometimes Rocky Road just has, like, marshmallow flakes or, like, these little tiny, almost, like, Lucky Charms-sized marshmallows. But these are, like, soft and squishy. Like, they literally just took a bag of mini marshmallows and dumped it into the ice cream. And it's delightful. And I've been sleeping on Tillamook ice cream. I've loved their cheese for many years, but just now getting into the ice creams.
That's awesome. So, it's been, like, 2 months. Like, right after we recorded our last episode, I got super into this podcast called Ologies, which is vaguely a science podcast, but it basically, this woman named Allie Ward, she's very quirky, and she's a very fun host, and very nerdy. And so she created this podcast just to be able to interview a bunch of experts in her field, and so each episode is a different ology. So, like, psychology, teleology, mythology, that kind of stuff. So it's just the study of something. So each new episode, you're learning tons of stuff about this random field, and it's the most fun ever. I'm working my way through that. I got caught up on a bunch of HBO TV shows. So Nora from Queens, it's a comedy starring Awkwafina that I would highly recommend for anyone in their late 20s in particular. I finally watched the last season of Insecure. Finally.
Nice.
And it's so good. They knocked it out of the park with the conclusion. I'm very happy. And then Gentleman Jack, which is like, I don't know, like 5 years old now. Yeah, but really, really great exploration of gender in a period drama. And then on the music front, Bad Sons, it's like an indie rock, I think, band. They've been releasing a series of singles that are building up to an album, I'm pretty sure. And literally every single one I'm obsessed with. I'm like, this is every single one. I'm like, they can't top the previous one, and then they do. So yeah, I've had those on repeat. I think that's everything.
My foot is so asleep.
Okay. Well, we'll free Victoria's foot from recording. She's in a tiny little closet.
That's with this podcast now. It's just like Closets of America.
What a journey.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support, our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fadland. Until next time, happy reading.